Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Leah Fairchild. I'm with the Constantia Institute, which is a think tank here in Brussels, looking at the impact of technology on society. Welcome to session 3, which is responsible data use, trust in emerging technologies towards a European way of handling data. And this session is going to discuss the current European data protection and privacy framework and how this may impact the development of emerging technologies, examining the specific obligations and rights that are relevant to the processing of personal data in AI systems. We're going to examine how stakeholders can continue to work together to maximize the value of the opportunity brought by the use of automation tools for decisions and based on personal data while combating harmful threats, misuse, and abuse. And we're going to explore issues around automated decision-making, trust, transparency, liability, and accountability. I'd like to introduce the 5 panel members for this panel this session. I'm going to start. You obviously see them in different order than potentially I do, so I'll start with Karen Meitlor, who is a Danish member of the European Parliament, representing the Danish Social Liberal Party. As an MEP, Karen is thoroughly invested in legal work, looking at technology and AI regulation, and she's active on consumer protection in the era of digitalization. David Martin, Senior Legal Officer and Digital Team Leader for the European Consumer Organization. David leads their digital policy team, where he focuses on privacy, data protection, copyright, and competition. Matthias Sellerus, Global Data Protection Officer and Head of Data Protection and Privacy at SAP. Matthias further heads SAP's export control as secondary regulatory responsibility. His professional experience spans the company's legal, public, policy, research, and intellectual property functions. Ellis Perry, Data Ethics Advisor, the UK Information Commissioner's Office. Ellis's remit is to articulate the interplay between data protection principles over which the ICO has regulatory insight and the emerging field of data ethics to communicate those views within the government. And finally, Stephanie Fink, Director EMEA, Government Affairs for Salesforce, where Stephanie has built and led Salesforce's government affairs and public policy efforts in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East since September 2013. Each of the speakers is going to have a 5-minute opening session, and then we're going to go into a panel discussion, which I look forward to. There's also going to be some Q&A, so if you have a question, please put it in the chat function, and we'll try to get that to the speakers as soon as possible. So Karen, perhaps we start. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leah. The subject of today is responsible data use and trust. And I think it's really crucial that we have trust in the way that our data is being used. In the recent years, this trust has been eroded, both because of scandals such as Cambridge Analytica and also targeting election campaigns that resulted in very tight results in, for example, Brexit and also the Trump elections back in 2016, which show that we are at a very different place than we were 12 years ago, when the use of data for political purposes and also for commercial purposes was at a different stage, where we actually trusted the use of data and thought that this would contribute to a better and safer world. At the moment, we have books coming out called Lie Machines and Surveillance Economy, and we are quite worried as citizens and consumers of our data use. At the same time, the innovation that is prompted by the use of data and the new tools that can be used, for example, in ensuring equal access to jobs, to information, requires that we have very specific use of data so that we include everybody. The book Invisible Women show that if we do not gender segregate our data, we might end up enforcing the existing inequalities that we have in our society. So we need to make sure that we have the data available to make sure that we have a society and that we have digital tools that provide equality and equal opportunity for everybody. But at the same time, we need to be able to protect our privacy. And therefore, we need to trust the legislation that we have in place and also the institutions and the companies that make use of our data. We have already a number of legislation that is protecting our data. The GDPR, which has been discussed during the day by a number of panels and keynotes, is one of the most successful pieces of legislation. But as somebody remarked, I think it was from Access Now, it is very good legislation, but the implementation has been kind of poor, because we have a regulation which should be applied equally in all member states. But there are so many exceptions that it's difficult to see how it is being implemented and how we can trust it. I think it's really crucial, if we want to make use of data and artificial intelligence to make a more green and a more just society, that we're able to trust the use of data. And at the moment, I don't think the general population trusts the use of data, both by authorities and by companies. The GDPR, from my perspective, provides very good tools for the time when we had data in big chunks, so that your profiling and the information that a company or authorities had about you was something that you would be able to go in and delete or adjust according to what was correct and what was truthful. But now, with the increased use of personalization and big data, which is actually having more and more small bits of data, it's very difficult to see how the tools that the GDPR gives you as a consumer and as a citizen will actually help you escape from targeting and being profiled. I think this is what is crucial that we get right this time when we are looking at the Digital Services Act that will be coming from the Commission next week. Because here we will be looking at the networks and the platforms that are making use of personal data. And therefore, we need to make sure that the advertisement and the business models that these companies have, that they make sense to build trust and to make sure that we can have personal data protection and privacy both now and in the future. I'm looking forward to the discussion and going into more detail with the fellow panelists, and please do ask questions in the comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. The concept of trust and also consumers' ability to trust leads very nicely into David, who is our next speaker for his presentation.
Thank you very much. I will start by saying that I fully agree with what Karen has said. And I think there's a lot of discussions about trust right now, and trust is a big word. And I also wanted to start by saying that trust is just one piece of the puzzle, let's say. There are many other factors that need to be taken into account. And if we were all in the same space in in the same place, I like to usually open up with a question to the audience, where I ask how many people are on Facebook, and usually a lot of people raise their hands. And then I ask how many people trust Facebook, and there's a substantial number, much less people that raise their hand in that situation, just to show that it's not only about trust that we have to worry about. But leaving that aside, it's true that we do need to generate this trust for consumers to be able to use the services and the technology that is being developed, and for the technology to deliver everything that it can bring to consumers individually, but also to society as a whole. For example, the potential that technologies such as artificial intelligence has to improve our daily lives and make things happen for the environment and the planet, generally speaking. So from a consumer perspective, what I would say, which elements are necessary to have this kind of trust? So first, we need to know and be able to understand what's actually going on, how things function, how does this technology work. So we really need to open the black box, let's say, how data is used. Second, you need, to the extent possible, to have a certain degree of control over what happens. You may or may not want to exercise that control, but because you cannot always expect that consumers are experts about everything and want to, for example, be tweaking every little setting in a smartphone, for example. But that possibility and that degree, at least a minimum degree of control, has to be there. And thirdly, you need to, as a consumer, be able to rest assured that no matter what happens, certain things are not going to happen, and that you have strong rights. And if something goes wrong, or if your rights are not respected, the mechanisms are there to make sure that the situation is corrected and that you get redress. For example, if you have suffered a damage. And these three elements, which I would say are the basic elements, they need to be set in stone. Let's say based, they have to be inserted into regulatory framework, into legislation. We cannot leave this up to self regulation, for example. And this is why regulation as the GDPR is so important from a consumer perspective. Now, once you have all that into legislation, what's the other element that's necessary? So you have to make sure that that legislation is actually applied in practice and that it is complied with and that it's enforced. And here is where we're having issues, for example, with the GDPR. So if we apply these elements and this situation to practical examples, so we have GDPR and I agree, good basis, good legislation. We're having issues with implementation and with enforcement. What about when we talk about artificial intelligence? There we see an artificial intelligence could be a broader topic about technologies like new technologies and artificial intelligence. There we see that we're missing the basic elements, the legislative framework that would be necessary. So for example, I can tell you about a survey that we published earlier this year in September, carried out in 9 countries by our member organizations, where they asked about consumer perceptions related to artificial intelligence. And one of the things that clearly came out is like the concerns that consumers have that certain of the problems artificial intelligence, and I'm talking about majority of respondents thought that AI would make that worse, and issues around discrimination, issues around manipulation. So a majority, again, of respondents thought that AI was already being used to manipulate their decisions. So we need to deal with all these things. And for that, we need to set up the right legal framework. And the point I wanted to make is like, is this legal framework having the right rules what's going to help develop the trust that we need? And what's going to ensure that we have this responsible use of data that we need. And we think that, and I'm going to finish with this, that regulation shouldn't be considered as something that stops innovations, much the opposite. We think that the regulation can actually spur innovation and foster good innovation. And also, I know that there's a lot of discussion about competing with other countries, China, the US. In our opinion, here it's the EU that has to aim to set the global bar and raise the bar globally, rather than bring down our level to meet the others. And here I always like mentioning something that I heard Margaret Vestager said, the commissioner. She said that we want the EU to be more like the EU, not be more like China or the US. So it's about setting the right frameworks to ensure that technology respects our values and freedom. So I'll stop there, and very happy to hear questions and comments.
Terrific, David. You have a very good point. Data drives innovation. We've seen a lot of innovation over the last 6 months due to necessity. And data is also most valuable when it's used in context. And then we need to figure out how do we use the data not in the wrong context, not in terms of only algorithms, but just how it's held, used, and protected. And with that, I'm going to turn to Matthias and have him introduce his point of view.
I'll just get right into what you just said, earlier. I mean, the question is really, what's the biggest challenge that we see currently in data handling with the emerging technologies? And it's no wonder what my predecessors, what the other speakers already said. It's about trust, generally I see, and Karen just mentioned some of the reasons for that. There are good reasons but for that. But overall, I have the impression that we as a society rather currently see the risks than the opportunities of the use of data. And it's true. Society as a whole has not had a broad debate about the benefits and the risks of the new technologies prior to its use. It's rather been that technological developments have taken place first and created facts. But this is nothing unusual. That's usually what happens. And if you look at it closer, we do have safeguards in place, such as the fundamental rights guaranteed in the treaties by the GDPR and our constitutions, just to handle these matters. However, the pace or the speed with which the new technologies are advancing around the globe is unparalleled. And I fear that if Europe does not want to fall behind, we don't have the luxury to debate whether or not we want to use these technologies, but we can and we should concentrate on the use of technologies in line with our values. This, however, will only be possible if we are open to development and use in Europe. We have little impact on technologies developed elsewhere in the world, and we will eventually have to use what others are creating in different circumstances if we do not step up to the game on our own. Now, if you ask me about the concrete issues, I'll give you one. It's very difficult, very challenging to train algorithms with real data. But on the other hand, if we want the results to match the real world, then the input for trainings should be as realistic as possible, so that algorithms can learn on our reality and not just some fiction. Or if you train on data from other parts of the world where the rules may be a bit different, then you get that reality of that part of the world, not ours. So the application of those algorithms then in technology over here will not be realistic. So that's why my point of view is that we need to get to a point that we accept that algorithms may learn about our society with the help of real data coming from many, many individuals. However, we should focus our data protection measures on mitigating the concrete risks to the individual and avoid that training data is misused in this sense. So we need to agree on a responsible use of data that does not harm the individual, but let's systems learn about society so that we can ultimately help our society become a better society. That means also that data in this regard must be handled with utmost care that reflects its values, both in the financial manner as well as also in the ethical manner. So data is not just something to play with. It is something that displays our society and that depicts the individuals in that society. And that's how we should deal with the data. And that I would stop here. And I'm looking forward to a good discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matthias. He's making a very valuable point. As part of our title is Towards the European Way of Handling Data. And the ethics and norms and values we have here, she says with her American accent, I am Belgian, I swear, that basically build the framework and the support for innovation. And with that, I'd like to turn this to Ellis in terms of a discussion on business ethics and data ethics.
Hi, yes, thanks for that. So I just want to pick up my introductory remarks by echoing what David said about innovation. And obviously it's the very firm view and communicated position of the data protection regulator here in the UK that the GDPR is not a barrier to innovation because it is technology neutral, obviously. And our mission is to uphold information law rights in the public interest, promote openness by public bodies, and data protection for individuals. And in order to increase this trust, and I think trust was the third word that Karen said, the third word of the kind of whole forum today was trust. And in order to increase the trust that the public housing, government bodies, and the private and third sectors, the Information Commissioner has three goals, three most important goals, the number one of which, the first Gate is to create a culture of accountability and transparency. I'm sure we're going to be hearing those words a lot, to explain the role data protection can play in encouraging innovation. And as Matthias said, you know, the European economy, it's never going to be more important that we are able to take advantage of this new innovation post-pandemic and the damage that that has done to the economy overall. The second goal is to improve standards of information rights practice through clear, inspiring, targeted engagement and influence. That's going to be very important, again, to increase and improve and maintain the trust that individuals have in how their personal data is being processed, particularly in the AI arena, where people are worried about bias and manipulation, which is something David was talking about. So in furtherance of these goals, the Information Commissioner's technology strategy was launched in 2017. All of this is available on our website. There's some great materials on the ICO's website. I do strongly urge you to go and look at all the great guidance that we've put out, including a guide called Big Data, Artificial Intelligence, Machine Learning, and Data Protection. There are 6 key recommendations, which I think are worth setting out here very briefly in my 5-minute introductory remarks, because they are the cornerstone of what the Information Commissioner is going to be looking for, and also encompass, include, would seek to protect individual, including in the training stage of the algorithm, so the training data set, which I think Matthias was talking about. So the 6 recommendations, which I'll run through very quickly: anonymize where possible, take the data out with. The GDPR, falling short of that, one-way pseudonymization or irreversible pseudonymization, falling short of that, two-way pseudonymization, possibly even within the same controllership that is allowed under the GDPR. Always think and keep a mind on purpose use limitation, that very important principle to make sure scope creep doesn't come into play, and also have an eye on the compatibility test in relation to the training data sets. Just-in-time meaningful privacy notices in order to maintain and improve consumer control. They need to understand what is happening, the transparency point under the GDPR, and they need to have somebody accountable should they wish to exercise their rights. They need to know who to contact and who's responsible within the organisation for making sure that their rights are honoured in a meaningful way. Data protection impact assessments may not always be strictly necessary, but are always desirable. They're very useful tools to minute your considerations, particularly around necessity and proportionality. Privacy by design and default. Let's not forget that. Technological and organizational measures to address security, particularly around the large data sets, but also data minimization, another principle. Don't forget that that's also very important. More and more data may not lead to better and better insights, not on every occasion. And develop, as I think Matthias just said, some ethical principles for smaller organizations to work to. Larger organizations may have independent ethics boards that advise them on the appropriateness of personal data processing operations. And audit your outputs, explain the rationale behind the decisions, check for bias, discrimination. I'm sure we will be addressing those very important components too. So the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners do have a declaration in 2018 on data protection and ethics, particularly in the AI world, and that identified trust as a key component of consumers' willingness to participate in the digital economy. And so I'll just finish my opening remarks now by running through that declaration's prescient recommendations, I would say, before the pandemic. This was in 2018, but they revolve around fairness. Make sure that what you're doing is within people's reasonable expectation and doesn't have undue discriminatory impacts, particularly on minorities within the population. Continued vigilance, accountability. Think about potentially unintended consequences of the processing, auditing, monitoring for that, human oversight. Who has the ultimate control in relation to the algorithm? Transparency, there's the T word again. think about how you're explaining what is happening to the audience or the impacted data subjects. Again, the Information Commissioner has an excellent document called Project Explain on her website that talks about context-specific explanations within the AI arena. Ethics by design, I like to think of this almost as a cellophane wrap, a clear wrapper around the data protection principles. If you look at things through an ethical lens, and if you can reassure yourself and your stakeholders that what you're doing is ethical, you are most likely to be in compliance with the GDPR, because the GDPR's principles have, to my mind certainly, very definitive ethical underpinnings to them. The first out of the gate, fairness, that's an ethical concept in and of itself. Think about how you are going to minimize bias and discrimination, not only from an ethical point of view, but of course there are laws over here in the UK around the Equalities Act, the Human Rights Act, that mandate that discrimination is illegal in certain concepts, although it is always obviously unethical, but there can also be a direct legal prohibition on having discriminatory hacks from algorithmic decision making. So I'll conclude my opening remarks there.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellis. Leading to Stephanie, last but not least, we've been discussing privacy by design, ethics by design, and looking at the value proposition that we have here being in the European Union. And I'll let you open your remarks because I know ethics by design is one of the areas you're really interested in.
Yes, and
yes.
Thank you, everyone. I think we heard a lot of keywords in the introductory remarks from everyone. Everything we do at Salesforce is guided by our values, and you'll hear them, and you'll see where this all makes sense. Number one is trust. Second is innovation. We have customer success. Obviously, the products need to work and be helpful. And the last one is equality. And this is how we look at all these questions. When we talk about emerging technologies, we have been in the cloud business for 20 years, which at that time probably was an emerging technology. And this is where you realize you need to put the right processes and the right principles in place when you build your own technology. For those who need convincing, I think we heard David mention a little bit how consumers look at things. Even though we're not in the consumer business, we're in a B2B company, but the end user is who matters. And we've asked them, and they recognize as a majority that they see the potential in technology. They see that technology can do good. They see a responsibility for companies, for businesses to improve society and to provide technologies that will help and do good. But they also see the harm that it can cause. And I think exactly linking to what David said, what is the harm that could be perceived? And the first risks that are mentioned are privacy, data leaks, misinformation, surveillance, all of that. And of course, our data also shows that more than 50 of them see and they're worried about ethics. So what companies, how should they react to that? Well, our solution has been to put ethics by design the same way you implement privacy by design. And what does that mean? First of all, is to not look at them separately and to bring teams that go across the organization. We've created an Office of Human and Ethical Use of Technology. And that means that across all the organization inside a company, you would have a team that would ask all the questions that we mentioned, that will establish processes and guiding principles that will go from looking at how we develop the product, how we look at legal questions, how we develop our policies, and we'll consult, because that's also the question. We don't want to have isolated teams working on products or isolated group of people. If you want to be inclusive, if you want to avoid inequalities, you have to consult very largely. So we'll have internal groups that are consulted. We seek feedback externally. We created an advisory group to look at all these questions. And this is type of the processes I'd be happy to look into the discussion. Just to look at ethical AI, obviously it's one thing to say you have to have processes and guidelines, but the ones that we've put in place, that's building on what Ellis said, the 5 key words or key principles for us would be responsible AI first. It's highest security and privacy. Second, accountability. Seek feedback. Don't do it on your side. See what is the impact of what you're doing. Talk to people. Get advice. Look at science, at data. Third one, we said it before, transparency. Explain, understand. What is the why behind a decision made by AI, a recommendation, a prediction? You need to have it to be explained to the person who are using the tool. Then you have empowering. AI is all about augmenting human capability. And so that's the end goal. It should really create more growth and actually a better outcome for society as a whole. And the last one, it has to be inclusive. And that's where it's really key. It's not only looking at the algorithm, it's looking much further. It's looking at the team, at who does it, how we do it. And these are processes that go beyond GDPR, beyond privacy. Privacy is a big part of that. But this is the approach that we've taken. And to look briefly and to say a few words about the regulatory framework, it has to be targeted. It has to be clear so that we have very clear principles that we need to safeguard, but also very targeted to the real outcome and what really matters, so that everybody knows what's their North Star. We have our values, but legislation should also be simple to understand and for companies to implement. And obviously also very aware of the fact that there are different options and different contexts where information is being used and what is the purpose. I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. I'm going to open up a couple of questions to the panel. I've already got some questions coming in from the audience, and there's a theme here, so I'm going to kind of streamline the theme. We'd start with a discussion of trust, and trust is part of the value chain between the government, the companies, the consumers, of how we're actually exchanging transactions, data for something else. I did a project a number of years ago for the Commission looking at the economics of privacy. And the question is, we put the privacy issue in the hands of the consumer. Many of them are not educated enough about what's happening with that data for them to know if they want to delete it, provide it, etc. In creating this role of trust, where in the value chain should the transparency lie as to what's happening with the data? This should be a carrot or a stick. Should it be the government mandating regulations? This is how you have to behave with data audits enforcing the issue, or a matter of companies coming forward and saying, hey, consumer, hey, other businesses, this is what I'm doing with your data. And this is the whole transparency of the process. Where should we put the onus of responsibility for data privacy in the use of things like AI and blockchain? Is this the person offering the data or the person using the data, or both? Now, I don't know if Karen wants to start this discussion or not, but from a point of view of the role of trust, should we be implementing this in what way in terms of possibilities?
I think it's important that we come away from the situation at the moment where it's up to the citizen or the consumer to investigate whether the service or the company that they are using or want to use is trustworthy, and if they're treating their data correctly and not sharing it with lots of data brokers and it disappearing off into the world. Because I really want us to be at a place where you're able to use any type of artificial intelligence provider, any type of digital platform, digital services, and know that your data will be safe. So I think there needs to be a minimum of legal requirements so that you know that you can go and buy a digital service or a product and you will not be exposed. On the other hand, I also think that having digital trust is a great selling point for European businesses. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I think it would be good to have a way of showing that certain companies are doing more than just the legal requirements. There is an initiative that's going to be launched this week by the Danish government and business authorities, having a stamp of a seal of approval of digital trust. I'm not quite sure if having another seal for consumers and citizens is the way to go, but at least this is one way of doing it where you sort of have a certification or some control of what you're supposed to be doing, and that you can say, okay, I'm not just buying something from somebody that is living up to the minimum standard, but somebody that does a little bit better and thinks about ethics all the way.
The reason I'm asking the question, I have two questions here from the audience. Both are around the consumer driving the relationship of protecting their own data. One talking about having access to what personal data is being held where. The other one's talking about privacy knowledge management tools. That in essence, the consumer should be the one driving the privacy of their own data. I appreciate as a consumer, I'm very concerned about how my data is used, but I'm not always the most knowledgeable, especially when it comes to something like AI, under what context it's being augmented and under what context it's being slotted into a certain context. And I don't know if David wants to join in here from the consumer's perspective, but in what way can we better educate the consumer on how their data might be used? So to make them perhaps a bit more knowledgeable and then providing information. I think, yeah, there you go.
Okay, now, thank you. Well, I first wanted to quickly comment on the previous question. I don't think that the burden should be put on the consumer, and it links with this question as well. I think that it should be clear in the law what can and cannot be done, and there are certain things that simply shouldn't be allowed. And as I mentioned in my initial remarks, and partly Karen mentioned this as well, I want to rest assured if I'm using a service that there are things that simply don't happen, and I don't need to be faced with that type of choice, because it's clear that there's also we must acknowledge that there are ways of making consumers do things without realizing that they're doing them, or without them actually having a choice that they should have. Let's just put it that way.
Well, you did mention platform usage. For example, some folks have to use Facebook to get access to certain applications or pieces of information. They may not be on the platform an active user, but that this is where information messages are being posted. Therefore, they have to have access. So.
Yeah, but not only about that. I'm talking about the so-called, for example, dark patterns, which are like design tricks in user interfaces where you design the page in a way that you basically are telling the consumer what they have to click on, and they just simply click on that without realizing what they're doing sometimes. So this type of issues is sometimes it comes down to details which consumers don't realize basically how the whole thing is rigged, let's say.
Stephanie, you want to give an example here too? You mentioned.
Yeah, sure. And it's maybe I don't think it's very clear cut on whose responsibility it is. It's obviously a joint one. It's a value chain. So we would be more on the side of providing tools. And it would be in a way easy to say, well, look, we're giving you the AI and it's the customer who does what they want with it. We can't control. But that's not our approach. And it's also not the approach we should have anymore. And you can actually have features where you help the user or the consumer, depending on the angle we're taking, actually realize the power they have in decision. For instance, one feature you can have is to flag sensitive data and say, okay, like we don't know exactly what you're doing because it's your data. But hey, when you're tracking, I don't know, even a zip code from where people live, or age, or gender, this is sensitive data, could lead to bias or could lead to something. And then at least you have the responsibility to say, hey, here's a flag. And by the way, we have a tool that helps you look which variables are correlated to the sensitive data. And then you see the link. So it's not just say, okay, you put your data, the algorithm does the magic. No, it's like, here is the moment you should check. This is what, that's the potential impact of what you're doing. And I think, I don't know exactly where we put that in legislation, but clearly there is a joint responsibility on how we use the tools. I think we should move away from the black box. That would be the algorithm.
In this value chain, you have obviously the platform providers, and we have two here, Salesforce and SAP, but you also have people implementing on the platforms. Government should provide some level of guidance, which is not necessarily regulation, but guidance to help with innovation. Platform providers should also potentially help provide some level of guidance as to appropriate use in appropriate context. In what way can we do that if I am, let's say, a small startup opening my web shop with the best will in the world that I don't want to abuse data, but I also don't know quite what I'm doing? Where do I get my support and guidance from? I don't know who would like to jump in on that one. Go ahead, Matthias.
I could take it. So I'm not sure. Can you hear me, or am I muted right now? Okay, good. So if you're a small company, you will probably go, you will not develop your software on your own. You will use the software by a provider. You will probably use a platform on which you run your web shop. And that also determines to a large extent on how you're using data. And maybe you yourself, you won't even know what's happening in the background, what's happening in the product offering that you have. And that's where the platform provider have also an obligation to add to this game. And just to introduce the other keyword, the twin, so to say, of trust, that's transparency. Transparency is very, very important. So I think you do have a responsibility if you run your own business, if you become controller of data, of the data that you collect, to inform yourself and to learn up on how data is being processed by your platform provider and to select the appropriate platform provider. And those platform providers actually who provide the best transparency and have end-to-end processes in place that show how data is being dealt with in a responsible manner, in an ethical manner, and is given the value that it has for you as the controller of it, but also for the individuals, your customers, the data subjects, that data is basically being played with, but basically used for a certain purpose and not beyond. If you can show all that, you add to that equation, you add to that trust. If you can then explain that in very simple terms, that will also help to gain the trust of the consumers. Because ultimately, let's be clear, we are processing more data every day. And our society is a data-driven society, and we will need more data. That, however, will only work with a good feeling for everyone if we have clear rules by which we abide, if we work on them to meet these objectives in a good and creative manner, creative in a good sense of things, and if then people can actually rely that they get a benefit, but that they don't get the risk of it. That must be the goal. And there I see a large responsibility of the large providers as well as of the small startups that need to deal with with these tools.
It leads us to discuss GDPR to some extent. This is a good start. It's a good starting point to recognize data protection. It's a two-part question. Is GDPR enough? And does GDPR actually assume we're using things in an ethical manner? So first of all, is GDPR enough? And I don't know if Ellis wants to pop in on this or...
Yeah, so thanks for that. I'll just kind of preface, I've been making some notes in the background. And I think as part of the value chain, we're absolutely right. Certainly how I kind of perceive it at the moment is that we've got the inherently ethical principles of the GDPR acting as a safety net, if you like, and then the upfront protections we've got in terms of the transparency. And I love the idea of seals and codes of conduct. I think they're going to be super useful in this area. If only somebody would have the courage to bring one to us. We'd be really keen as a regulator to work in this area on a code of conduct or a certification seal. The next kind of layer, we've then got the guidance that comes out of the supervisory authorities, the data protection supervisory authorities. I think our guidance is excellent. We even have something called the AI auditing framework that will really give organizations kind of a clue into what we would be looking for if we were to visit you and conduct an audit. We've given you the audit checklist up front to help you get towards compliance. And ultimately, despite all of that, if you fall short, then obviously we as the regulator are there to enforce. But let's not forget the GDPR gives people representative action. So it may not be the regulators that are going to be your biggest headache, if you like, if you get this wrong. It could very well be a representative action from an activist group, as I think we've seen recently that, begin to put you to proof, to hold your feet to the fire to see how you are adhering to the GDPR. When you're a small or medium to size enterprise, which I believe the majority of the EU economy is, I understand that a lot of this might seem overwhelming, which is why I think seals and codes of conduct would be very helpful. But insofar as they don't yet exist and it is overwhelming, I've been doing some work in my role with the Open Data Institute and the Institute for Business Ethics, and their constituency is the small to medium-sized enterprises, and they both have ethical frameworks, ethical documents, ethical decision-making process-based toolkits that small to medium-sized enterprises that may not be staffed full of lawyers can help them to structure their decision-making and weight appropriate interests in a fashion which meets their record-keeping obligation also under the GDPR. So there's loads of great stuff out there. I think it's just about going out, finding what works for you, and then kind of pulling it towards you. But I'll just conclude with the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation here in the UK, which is an independent advisory body, but has been set up by our government to investigate and advise on how the UK takes advantage of data-driven technologies. And they're there to provide advice to guidance and regulators, including the ICO, and importantly, industry, on responsible innovation, strong and trustworthy governance in order to promote trust and assist with the uptake in the digital economy, including exploring, as part of their remit, bias in algorithmic decision-making in high-risk sectors. And the high-risk sectors that I think I've seen mirrored quite neatly in the EU Commission's white paper on AI are policing, justice, recruitment, areas where bias, particularly in training data sets, may begin to be highly problematical.
I don't know if David wants to join here. We'd had this discussion before on ethics and GDPR, but I'm curious as to how much we have a question from SMR in the chat section here, looking at cookies and consumer education, where the consumer has the possibility, not only from legal means, but to basically say what they will and will not accept in terms of the engagement. How do we educate the consumer better, not only to ask for those ethics, to in essence demand by the point of not going to folks who don't offer the appropriate context of usage? David, is something happening with the consumer organization as to educate consumers more about what their rights are?
Yeah, this is clearly a key point. We still need to raise a lot of awareness about what the rights of consumers are in this context, and how to exercise this right, and how to we need to also educate consumers more about what are the potential consequences of the use of data, and what the issues are, what happens behind the scene. I mean, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done from that point of view. But and this is why also transparency is so important. But I really want to underline that the all the burden, let's say, shouldn't be put on the consumer to be that they have to be an expert on how the digital economy works and on how to do everything. I mean, you have to be an expert on financial services to get your house mortgage. You have to be an expert on data management to access a news site, because you have to fiddle with all the settings in the cookie notice. So yeah. I think we have to make this much easier for consumers, and that's why I always underline as well on making clear what can and cannot be done. This is very important, setting clear rules and clear red lines on what can and cannot be done. And coming back to the question from SMR on the cookie banners, yes, I think that there's still a lot of room for developing technical tools, let's say, for people to exercise their rights. But you also need to cater for all those that do not have the knowledge or the possibility to go into using all these technical tools. And that's why I come back again to the issue of making clear what are the red lines. And for example, the cookie walls, that's still a huge problem. And I haven't seen a lot that I would say are complying with the GDPR and would allow you to get informed consent. But this actually reveals a bigger problem. It's like we're trying to use the cookie walls to make GDPR compliant something that probably isn't, which is the way the whole digital advertising system works right now with all the third parties and the data brokers. So until we fix that part with the business practices and business models and how that works, there's no way a cookie wall or a cookie notice or a cookie banner is going to be able to get you fully GDPR informed, valid consent, let's say.
I want to swing this back down from the consumer to regulation, regulatory policy. We framed this conversation talking about data as the driver for innovation in the EU. So not just a matter of the downside of use of data, but the positive aspect of the use of data. And we've been talking about things like facial recognition, AI, other things, blockchain, other things that I can put into processes to make the workflow flow better. Where do we ensure that the regulations we're putting in place allow companies to be innovative, to use that positive front side and train their systems for that process efficiency that's going to be a benefit to everyone in the value chain? So not just where do we block them, but how do we enable them, incentivize them to do this in a more ethical manner, ethics by design, privacy by design? How do we incentivize?
How do we incentivize them to be more ethical in their use of data and create
Also,
more innovative? I think we need to sort of make the business case for companies that there is added value in showing that you use data in a good way. And I think one of the ways that we can also help companies to drive innovation using data is by providing access to data, even for startups and small and medium-sized companies. The data strategy from the Commission and also the data governance initiative will hopefully be able to enable companies to access non-personal data and also perhaps mixed data in an ethically sound way, where they can create new businesses, new ideas, innovation with data. Because if they don't have the data necessary to, for example, train AI, then they will not be able to create something new.
Could the Commission actually support data sets? I mean, that are structured with some level of design and ethics that is transparent to anyone testing with it? David, you had a comment on ethics by design as well you wanted to add. Sorry.
Yes, no. So on this one, I would say that it's key to get the principles right. So the principles that form the basis in regulation, fairness, security, transparency, they are enough to guide the use of the data in a way that would be legal. So I think that the answer to this question is getting the principles right, in my opinion. On the ethics by design, I just wanted to make a point that from our perspective, ethics, of course, are very important. And we welcome that companies are doing all these efforts to be more ethical. But I have a question. It's like, how do you enforce ethics? If ethics are not inserted into regulation and they are not respected, how do you protect yourself? How do you make this respected afterwards? So we are all for ethics by design, etc., but all these ethical principles need to be put in regulation. That's what.
And harmonized. I don't think we all agree what ethics actually is from society and country and culture. What is not acceptable. But the other question is, who can help educate the people developing the processes about using those data sets? And I'm going to turn to our two platform providers here to some extent. Is it where in the value chain should someone who's developing a business model, who's developing a business, get the support to create ethical applications, ones that are reliable in terms of the data they collect and the way they use them? And where should they get that support and education to help them do that?
Should I give it a try? So I think that's the role of people like Stephanie, myself, and other colleagues in these areas that know the regulation, that can provide some guidance. There are some, Stephanie mentioned, companies usually have steering committees, panels with external advisors, sounding boards. Same SAP does the same kind of thing in order to get a broad kind of perspective on a responsible use of new technologies. That's something that needs to be translated so that developers, product architects can actually use that. So that's the one thing. But there's another thing that I wanted to add here to that comment as well. We are quite good in Europe at putting together regulation. The problem with that regulation is that showing the stick has basically shied a lot of companies, small companies, big companies away from actually being creative in their technologies, at least as far as Europe is concerned, because they fear the big fines and other consequences. So that's one of the major showstoppers. So we at SAP, we take the perspective that, for example, we try to align with our regulators upfront and try to be in a constant discussion with them so that we create some safe room for what we can do and what we cannot do. Now, I can say that this works quite well. Of course, companies would like to go in some instances a bit further, and that's why my plea would actually be to say we need to create new codes of conduct. Alice just mentioned that before, where we can, on a broader level, agree on some sort of a data lab, so that the privileges that you have for research in the GDPR, for example, could also be usable under the same conditions, under proper monitorship for private companies to come up with new ideas. As I just put in my opening statement, we need to accept that we use data in order to learn about our society, not necessarily about the individual. So we can protect the individual when we use their data for actually learning about society, training our algorithms that we will then apply, but we will not expose or track the individual per se. That, of course, needs to be in transparent and secure processes. It needs to be properly monitored. And then, of course, it needs to make sure that data relating to an individual does not stay in the systems, but that only the trained algorithms and data are going to be used. That's about a rough concept of how we are working on things, where I would say we need to see how we can evolve that jointly further.
We've had a question from the University of Waterloo in regards to structuring decision making. If I am looking to get some of these that we were just discussing, creating these platforms, creating these means of explaining ethics to folks, how can I use AI better? And wait for this. If AI is supposed to be supporting me in making decisions, all right, how do we structure this ethics by design again in such a way that the decisions I'm making are in context with the values of society? So is this just going, looking at the impact for the business or the impact for the country? Or is this, how do I tie this to something that's more about a societal impact, about how I'm using things like facial recognition, public health data? Stephanie, seems like you want to answer the question.
No, it's a beautiful question. It's everything so I'd speak at length about how, we say we create an office of ethical and human use of technology. I mean, that's a good word. And then it's how do you make it work, right? As a company, which question do you filter to which level? Who has the discussion? Basically, in the company, everyone can have a say and pose a question, and we'll all look at it. And one thing that we all need to embrace, because that's the only way about, is that we won't have different definitions. So it's also accepting that not everything works the same everywhere. And yes, the decision making is not always easy. And I think we all need to accept that there is room for maneuver. We need guiding principles. And I think we can all agree to some principles. But yes, the way is not easy. But if you really look at those principles, we all mention the same words. And we all mentioned, like you can say, transparency, accountability, explainability. And I think if we move away from that black box, from my perspective, the time where you don't have to explain is almost gone. And I know it's not everywhere, and that's where the pace of technology, it's going fast. But the direction, I think, is clear. I mean, that we all start our discussion with trust. It's also because we're listening. And I think anyone who wants to get guidance, there are plenty of places. Elise mentioned the Center for Data Ethics. There are more and more of those. You can have it in-house, but I think there are so many people who are passionate to talk about this. And for me, it's not something we can ignore anymore. And it has to be part of it, and as early as possible. Because the last thing you want to be is the person that says, oh, you can't do your product because of this and that. You have to, when you do your product, think about the intent, the intended impact, and the actual impact right away. And I think this is what needs to change. So for me, it's like the decision making as early as possible.
Go ahead, Karen. I think you wanted to add something here, or?
Well, I also think it's a way of also structuring your data, because if you don't really understand the impact that the data use will have and how careful you need to be with exposing data, then it becomes quite difficult to have an understanding of where your product is actually going. I think it really is an education for all people working with data, that you need to think things through before you create the product. And there was a question earlier also on, should we enable the the data provider to control the data. I think it's a little bit. I have two issues with it. One, that if you say that I should be the one responsible for controlling the use of other people's use of data or my data, I get the onus put on me as a consumer or citizen, but also that it's difficult I don't want to commercialize data, as I see data privacy as a fundamental right. But I do think that the concept that we will be looking at after the Commission comes up with their proposals is data altruism, and trying to make a structure where we can provide our data, also our personal data, that can then be used. But we need to have the trust, otherwise the altruism won't be there.
I realize we have about 10 minutes left. What I'd like to do is to go to each panelist and basically ask you the same question. This panel was regarding the European way of handling data. And I want to emphasize that because responsible data use, transparency, trust, everything we've been talking about, it's not necessarily a function of the actual emerging technology, whether it be facial recognition, artificial intelligence, different forms of automation. It's the way we proceed, not only with regulation for supporting, but structure to enable people to be innovative. What is missing at this point in time from your perspective, and again, you come from different organizations, to help enable the value chain to address it in a European way, in a more societal benefit way, not just for business quick wins, not just for making hard and fast decisions about immigration or who gets what medical treatment, but in essence, being able to create new business models and new innovations within the European sphere. I'm not sure who would like to go first. I haven't heard too much from David or Ellis in the last few minutes. So would one of you like to go first?
I can. I mean, from my perspective, it depends on also what area we're talking about. If it's just use of data, or if it goes beyond and it's about artificial intelligence, algorithms, etc., etc. But I think my answer would be that first of all, we need better compliance and enforcement of existing rules, like the GDPR. But we are also missing some of the basic legal framework for guiding the development of technology further in areas such as algorithms and artificial intelligence.
Okay. Ellis, would you like to join?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and over here in the UK, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has just extended the consultation window on the national data strategy. So I think these issues, as you've identified, Elia, are being actively thought about by government. I think they've become more acute because of the pandemic and the devastation that's wrought upon the economy, and how much more important this sector or aspect of the economy is going to be moving forward. And to my mind, all of this is about how do we define fair, as we were talking about earlier. It's what may be considered fair in China, may be vastly different from the US, may be different from Europe. But insofar as we as Europeans, and I will include the UK in that overall arching word European, insofar as we have our values, which we do, our fundamental charter values, it's about articulating what we think of as fair. And that's where I see the intersection, which is my particular interest, between data ethics and the GDPR, is how are organizations articulating what is fair? And I think that speaks to organizational values, their principles, and how they are weaving those appropriately into the tapestry of their process-based decision-making flow. Large organizations tend to, make decisions in a kind of linear way. And part of that linear decision making, to my mind, should be a kind of cross-check or a gateway of, we believe this is fair, including to wider society, including to the impacted individuals, including to us as an organization, and our right to run an organization, our fundamental right to have a business within the European Union. And how are we balancing this milking stool, this tripod of interests, to make sure that we get a sweet spot in the middle of
I like the tripod of
fair.
interest. I can just visualize that. So that's a very good discussion point. Stephanie, you were nodding there. Is there something you'd like to add as well?
Yes, no, and to briefly to your question, I liked what Ilse said about the safety net earlier on. And I think that's from my perspective, that's what we need. We need a safety net that addresses the main challenges posed by emerging technology. And we talked about some principles, and that's what the Commission is tackling now. But that safety net that links to our values that we all agree, if it's not a clear definition of ethics as of now today, but values that we know this will be our bottom line, and that once it's understood and we have it, then we need to show the potential. And I like the reward for being fair. Because what we want is people to embrace it, and it's a bit stopping the discussion about can we trust it. Is no, we agree on our principles, and then we move on, and we show the potential, and we show the good in it, instead of emphasizing the flaws which exist. And it's really putting our finger on them, addressing them, and
it's
then moving
harmonizing what we all agree is fair. It's not necessarily a bare minimum, but let's call it a cost plus or a value plus concept. Okay. I haven't heard from Matthias and Karen. Who would like to go first? Karen, please.
I can go first. I mean, one of the criticisms that we as regulators are often met with is that we're only seeing the risks and not looking for the opportunities. Mm-hmm. And I think this is perhaps based on a lack of trust in the solutions that we have at the moment. I think if we start having greater trust in the use of data, then we will dare experiment more. And I think to build this trust, we need to have good regulation. And that is regulation that is clear and easy to use for companies and for citizens. And that's where I think that the GDPR failed a bit, and where we need to improve on the legislation that we're building now. Also to be adapted to the situation of technology and use of data that is now and in the future. So that's going to be the real challenge, allowing us to trust more so that we can innovate more.
The concept of trust also needs to be throughout the value chain, not just with the regulators, not just with the companies, and not just with the consumers either. It should be everyone working together towards a better goal for innovation, to have better services, better workflows, things that enable us to be more efficient, effective, and working together in a more holistic way. Matthias, did you want to add some more on this as well?
Yeah, with pleasure. So if you want to focus on innovation, you need to first of all think about where the innovation should come from. If you say it should come from companies and also small businesses, then you need to put yourselves into the shoes of these small companies and also the big businesses actually. And what you usually learn when you go to business school is that every startup will create some sort of a business model canvas at some point in time. And there are several aspects of that. You do market research. You try to look what your consumers or your potential customers might want to buy. Whereas your unique selling point that is different from others. There's a lot of things that companies do, and there's one thing we discussed about the unique European way as the unique selling point. That may be one of the things that the market will actually have to show. But if you look at the business model canvas, you usually have in the lower right quadrant, you have one thing that we, the people here in this panel, can actually influence, and that's the market conditions in itself. So if I look at regulators, they need to be create an environment with a safety net, as it was discussed before, of trust, where startups can also fail without facing existential damages or existential kinds of fines. That stops a lot of innovation. I mentioned that before. Then on the other side, the companies in itself can basically gain that trust by being transparent, by having models that show that they have data under their control, that they value it the same way we do that. If you say data is the new oil, then let's not spill a drop. Let's not lose it. Let's not just flow it around, but deal with that with utmost care. Handle it like it is your biggest treasure, and all of that is something that we can influence. So regulators need to be create the safe environment, and companies need to earn it with a trust. Thank you.
That is an excellent way to end the panel. That's a lovely phrase. But I'd like to thank all the panelists. I appreciate your contributions today. I think we can all recognize the fact that there is a European way of handling data, and what we've been discussing here, going beyond GDPR to build that safety net, that framework that we can all work in, is something we should all be working towards to be a much more innovative society. So Stephanie, Karen, David, and Matthias, and Ellis, thank you very much for your contributions today. The next session, session 4, is cross-border electronic evidence in law enforcement. So what it means for data privacy and fundamental rights. I'd like you to stay tuned, and that'll be starting shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.